5 bullets were shot, one to the head of a woman, the second to a 6-year-old boy, the third to a boy just a year old, and 2 more let loose. On Wednesday, July 10th, 2024, 5 loud bangs were heard around the 400 block of Kitty Hawk Road in Alameda, California. After just a few minutes of guessing, a neighbor called the police, and upon arrival, the unthinkable was found at the residence of Shane Killian. This is the twisted case of Shane Killian. Fathers were meant to protect, but what happens when a man is not ready to shoulder that responsibility? How does he escape? He simply kills the one he was meant to protect. Quite a smart decision, don't you think? Well, that's where there is a problem. You see, there are things called laws, and when you break them, you face serious consequences. And in Shane's case, serious is an understatement. The morning of Wednesday, July 10th, 2024 dawned quietly on Kitty Hawk Road in Alameda, California. The residents of the 400 block were going about their daily routines, unaware of the sudden disturbance that was about to unfold. At the residence of Shane Killian, a loud conversation could be heard, escalating into a heated argument. But to the neighbors, it didn't seem out of the ordinary. Just a loud discussion that would likely blow over. But then, without warning, 5 loud bangs were heard coming from there. The sudden noises caught the attention of a neighbor living next door to Shane's residence. Initially, he thought it might be fireworks, but something didn't sit right with him. He decided to dial 911, reporting the incident to the authorities. His reasoning was simple yet profound. Better safe than sorry when it comes to the safety and well-being of others. Little did he know his quick thinking and vigilance would prove crucial in the unfolding events. As the police arrived on the scene, they began to piece together the shocking truth behind the argument and the mysterious bangs. The neighbor's instinctive decision to call for help had set in motion a chain of events that would change the lives of those on Kitty Hawk Road forever. As the police officers arrived at the residence of Shane Killian, they were met with a scene that would soon reveal a disturbing truth. Shane, who was about to leave his house, was confronted by the authorities, and his demeanor changed in an instant. His confidence was replaced by nervousness, and fear could be seen in his eyes. The officers' trained eyes picked up on Shane's signs of distress, and they immediately sensed that something was amiss. When they questioned him about the loud noises that came from his residence, Shane's fear became obvious. He stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror, as he struggled to form a coherent response. The police noticed his inability to speak and quickly realized that he was on the verge of a breakdown. Without hesitation, the officers swiftly entered Shane's house, their instincts guiding them to investigate further. As they stepped inside, they were met with a chilling silence as they froze at the sight of 5 bloody corpses lying in Shane's living room. 5 victims lay motionless: Shane Killian's wife, Brandon Natali, his father-in-law, Miguel Angel Carcamo, and his mother-in-law, Marta Morales. Nearby, the bodies of Natalie and Killian's 2 young sons, who had been visiting their parents, added to the heart-wrenching tragedy. The room once filled with warmth and family memories was now filled with pure silence. The sight was so terrifying that the policemen, who were the first to see the scene, were left in shock, unable to gather the courage to even check if the victims were still alive. The gruesome image of lifeless bodies lying across the room was etched into their minds. Without a moment's hesitation, they turned back to Shane Killian, arresting him on the spot. The urgency of the situation drove them to quickly call for an ambulance, their voices barely steady as they reported the dire circumstances. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics moved with haste and caution, carefully checking each victim for any sign of life. The atmosphere was tense, and the air was heavy with the weight of the tragedy. After thorough examinations, 4 out of the 5 victims were declared dead on the scene: Brandon Natali, Miguel Angel Carcamo, Marta Morales, and one of Shane's young sons. The only glimmer of hope was Shane's 1-year-old son, who, though alive, was in critical condition and fighting for his life. The paramedics worked quickly to stabilize the child, preparing him for immediate transport to the hospital in a desperate bid to save him. After Shane Killian was arrested, the police, accompanied by a team of seasoned investigators, meticulously combed through his residence in search of clues that might shed light on the terrible incident. The search was thorough, with each room being examined in painstaking detail. Investigators scanned for any signs of a struggle, heated argument, or evidence that could explain the tragic events. The living room, the scene of the crime, was searched first. They examined the furniture, walls, and floors for any signs of a confrontation. Bloodstains were cataloged, and the positions of the bodies were noted, but nothing immediately stood out as a clue to the motive of the events. The team hoped to find personal items like letters, notes, or messages that might reveal underlying tensions or conflicts, but their search yielded nothing. They moved through the rest of the house with equal diligence. In the kitchen, they looked for signs of broken dishes, spilled food, or anything else indicative of a struggle. The bedrooms were searched for personal diaries, journals, or hidden items that might provide context. They even inspected the bathrooms and closets for any hidden compartments or discarded items that could be relevant. Despite their exhaustive efforts, everything appeared disturbingly normal, as if the household had been in a state of quiet domesticity before the incident. They analyzed Shane Killian's computer and mobile devices, hoping to find digital footprints, emails, messages, or social media interactions that might hint at brewing discord or plans. Forensic experts examined the devices, but again, nothing unusual surfaced. Shane's online presence revealed no suspicious activity, no alarming communications, and no digital breadcrumbs that could explain the sudden eruption of violence. The investigators also interviewed neighbors and acquaintances, hoping to uncover any recent changes in behavior or signs of trouble within the family. However, most described Shane and his family as a typical quiet household with no apparent issues. There were no reports of loud arguments, domestic disturbances, or anything else that would suggest an imminent crisis. As the hours turned into days, the investigation team grew increasingly frustrated. Despite their best efforts, they were left with more questions than answers. The lack of evidence suggesting a heated argument or serious fight added to the mystery. It was as if the tragic event had occurred in a vacuum, without any preceding indicators or warning signs, which was very rare. The search for a motive continued to be tough, and the investigators were left to piece together a puzzle with seemingly missing pieces. Leaving Shane's house without finding any significant clues, the investigation team met a dead end. With no physical evidence to guide them, the investigators turned their focus to two potential sources of information: Shane's neighbors and Shane Killian himself. Determined to leave no stone unturned, the police began canvassing the neighborhood. They knocked on doors, introducing themselves and explaining the purpose of their visit. The neighbors, initially shocked by the news, were cooperative and willing to share whatever they knew. The officers asked detailed questions about the family's routine, any unusual activities or visitors, and any sounds or disturbances they might have heard in the days leading up to the incident. Several neighbors presented their observations, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. They described the Killian family as quiet and unassuming. Some mentioned seeing Shane playing with his children in the yard, while others recalled friendly waves exchanged during morning walks. No one reported any loud arguments or suspicious visitors, and there were no recent changes in the family's behavior that stood out. Despite their thorough questioning, the neighbors' accounts provided little new information to advance the investigation. With the neighborhood canvass yielding little to no results, the police turned their attention to Shane Killian himself. Back at the station, they prepared for a critical interview with the primary suspect. The officers knew that Shane's responses could potentially provide the breakthrough they needed. They arrived at Shane's cell and swiftly escorted him to the interrogation room. Shane's face looked stoic, with no sign of emotion in it. Even before the questioning began, the detectives could sense from the cold, detached look in Shane's eyes that he would not be easily broken. His gaze was steady and unflinching. It reflected an inner resolve that hinted at either profound guilt or deep-seated shock. The interrogation room was small and simple, designed to strip away any sense of comfort. A single table and 3 chairs were the only furnishings, and a large mirror on one wall concealed observers who would scrutinize every word and gesture. Shane was seated at the table, and 2 seasoned detectives known for their skill in breaking even the toughest suspects took their places opposite him. They knew that breaking through Shane's icy exterior would be no simple task, but the gravity of the situation demanded persistence and precision. A veteran with a reputation for his calm demeanor and sharp intuition initiated the questioning. He started with basic inquiries about Shane's background, his relationship with his family, and his recollection of the events leading up to the tragic incident. The detective's tone was measured and almost conversational, aiming to put Shane at ease and encourage him to open up. A second detective sitting beside him observed Shane's every move, ready to interject with pointed questions when necessary. Shane's responses were simple and properly guarded. He spoke in short sentences, offering minimal details and maintaining a detached demeanor. His eyes remained cold and unreadable, and his voice carried no hint of the emotions expected from a man in his situation. The detective sensed that Shane was carefully controlling his narrative, revealing only what he deemed necessary while keeping his true feelings and thoughts hidden. The detectives decided to shift tactics. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a more direct and authoritative tone. "Shane, we need to understand what happened. Your family deserves the truth. Help us piece this together." Shane's expression remained unchanged. He repeated his previous statements, denying any involvement in the deaths and asserting his innocence. His responses were almost robotic, devoid of the emotional nuance that could indicate sincerity or deception. The detectives knew they needed to break through Shane's defenses. They began to introduce inconsistencies in their questioning, attempting to catch him off guard. They revisited details of the crime scene, the timeline of events, and Shane's interactions with his family. They pressed him on his relationships, looking for any hint of underlying tensions or motives. As the hours wore on, the detectives' persistence began to wear on Shane. His initial stoicism showed signs of cracking. Subtle shifts in his body language betrayed his growing discomfort. His eyes flickered with unease when certain questions hit closer to home, and his responses, though still guarded, became more hesitant. The detectives noticed these changes and decided to exploit them. He softened his tone, adopting a more empathetic approach. "Shane, we understand this is hard. Losing your family is unimaginable, but we need your help to make sense of this. There's got to be more to the story." For a brief moment, Shane's facade wavered. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, and his voice grew almost imperceptibly softer. "I didn't do it," he whispered, the first sign of emotion breaking through his stoic exterior. The detectives seized this opportunity, pressing Shane further. They gently but persistently questioned him about his relationships, his emotions, and any possible reasons for the tragedy. They painted a picture of a man under immense stress, grappling with personal demons and possibly driven to a breaking point. They suggested that understanding his motives, even if unintentional, could help the investigation. Shane's responses remained ambiguous. He neither confessed nor provided any concrete evidence to exonerate himself. The detectives knew they had made some progress, but it was not enough. They needed more than just hints of vulnerability. They needed a breakthrough. As the interrogation session drew to a close, the detectives decided to give Shane a brief reprieve. They left the room to confer with their colleagues, reviewing the information they had gathered and planning their next steps. They knew they needed to maintain the pressure but also offer moments of respite to prevent Shane from shutting down completely. Outside the room, the detectives discussed their observations. They agreed that Shane's cold demeanor was not impenetrable, and they had seen glimpses of the emotional turmoil beneath his surface. They decided to continue their strategy of alternating between empathy and pressure, hoping to eventually break through Shane's defenses and uncover the truth. The investigation was far from over, and the detectives were committed to unraveling the mystery. They re-entered the interrogation room, ready to continue their relentless pursuit of answers, determined to bring justice to Shane's family and uncover the full story behind the tragedy. They began by asking him how his day was. Maintaining the same cold demeanor, he said it was going just fine. Partially triggered by Shane's cold attitude towards the case, the policeman decided that he was done with the side talks and aimed for the head. He said he murdered his family. After his questions hit a brick wall, he explained to Shane that if he complied, he would receive a less heavy sentence, but if he didn't, when he'd finally get convicted, he would receive the death sentence. Upon hearing this, Shane replied saying he didn't kill anyone. After he gave that response, he completely ignored every question that came his way, effortlessly frustrating the police. As time went by, the police grew tired of being ignored and ordered for Shane Killian to be returned to his cell. At that point, the police and investigators on the case had been pushed way beyond their limit, so they had to pull the last card from their arsenal. The very next day, as soon as the clock hit 7 a.m., the police gave the neighbors of Shane Killian a visit. They went into the first house, sat down with the house owner, and began to explain why they were there. The first person they visited happened to be the same man who notified the police about the gunshots, so the police expected to get a lot of information from him, hoping that he wasn't going to let them down. The man, clearly anxious but resolute, immediately began the conversation by explaining why he had called the police on the night of July 10th. He took a deep breath, his eyes darting around the room as if recalling the events in vivid detail. "The reason I called," he began, his voice trembling slightly, was because right before I heard what sounded like fireworks, there was a heated argument going on at Shane Killian's house. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The detectives leaned in, and their interest piqued. "Go on," one of them encouraged quietly. He continued, "I've lived next door to the Killian family for years, and they've always seemed like a quiet, normal family. I've never noticed any signs of trouble or tension, but that night something was different. The argument I heard was loud and intense. It was unlike anything I had ever heard from them before." He explained that the Killian family did not have a history of public disputes or visible conflicts. They've always been private but friendly enough. We'd exchanged pleasantries in passing, but we weren't close. That night, though, it felt different. The shouting was loud enough to be heard through the walls, and it went on for a while. The detectives nodded, taking detailed notes. "Can you tell us exactly what you heard?" one of them asked. The neighbor thought for a moment, trying to recall specifics. "I couldn't make out everything they were saying, but it was clear that multiple people were involved. Shane's voice was the most distinct. He was shouting, and he sounded furious. I could also hear Branda, his wife, yelling back, and there were other voices, likely the in-laws, contributing to the commotion. It was chaotic." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Then, all of a sudden, there was a loud series of pops. At first, I thought they were fireworks, but the timing was strange. It didn't seem like a celebration or anything. It was just this rapid sequence of sounds, and then everything was eerily quiet. The detectives exchanged glances, and the pieces of the puzzle began to take shape. "What did you do after hearing the pops?" one of them asked. The man swallowed hard. "I was scared. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew it wasn't right. I debated with myself for a moment about whether to get involved directly, but I decided it was best to call the police. I didn't want to intrude or make things worse, but I couldn't just ignore it." His eyes reflected a mixture of guilt and helplessness. "I called 911 and reported what I heard. I told them about the argument and the sounds that followed. I stayed by the window watching for any signs of what might be happening, but I didn't see much. The police arrived fairly quickly after that." The detectives nodded, appreciating the neighbor's careful recollection. "You did the right thing," one of them reassured him. "By calling us, you may have prevented things from escalating even further." They continued to ask questions, probing for more details. "Had you ever heard or seen anything unusual from the Killian household before that night? Any signs of trouble, even minor ones?" The neighbor shook his head. "No, nothing. They always seemed like a happy family. Shane was a bit reserved, but he seemed to care about his family. Branda was always polite and kind. The kids were well behaved. That night was completely out of character for them." The detectives asked if he had any idea what might have sparked the argument. The man hesitated, then replied, "I wish I knew. Like I said, we weren't close. We exchanged greetings and small talk, but never anything deep. Whatever caused that argument must have been serious, though, for it to escalate like that." The interview lasted for over an hour, while the detectives meticulously extracted every possible detail. The neighbor's testimony added a crucial layer to the case, painting a picture of a seemingly normal family experiencing a sudden and violent upheaval. At the end of the interview, the detectives thanked the neighbor for his cooperation. "Your information is incredibly valuable to our investigation. If you remember anything else, no matter how small, please let us know immediately." The neighbor nodded, looking relieved to have shared his story. "I just hope you can find out what really happened. It's been haunting me ever since that night." The detectives assured him they would do everything in their power to uncover the truth. As they left, they reviewed their notes, discussing the implications of the new information. The neighbor's account of a sudden, intense argument followed by the sound of fireworks like pops provided a crucial lead. It suggested a potential timeline and sequence of events that they could cross-reference with other evidence. With that said, the police left to check out what the other neighbors had to say. After a few hours of going from house to house, they realized that the only information they were getting was the same as the one the first neighbor gave. They heard 5 loud bangs. With that fact established, they headed back to base, knowing that with what they already had, they could build a solid case against Shane Killian. When they arrived at the police station, the news about Shane's 1-year-old child came, and it was not a good one. According to the news, the child, who also had a bullet in him, did not make it through the surgery. After getting the news, the policeman immediately called for Shane Killian to be brought into the interrogation room. Once he arrived, the policeman told him about his son's death, but even after getting such bad news, he still didn't flinch. Once the policeman saw this, he immediately shifted his focus to reviewing Shane's offenses. After reviewing Shane's offenses, what Shane was being charged for was made clear. Shane Killian was charged with multiple felonies, including 5 counts of murder, where he took the lives of 36-year-old Brenda Natalie Morales, his 6-year-old son William Killian, his 1-year-old son Wesley Killian, his in-laws 70-year-old Miguel Angel Carcamo Ramirez, and 56-year-old Marta Morales Diaz. Shane Killian was also charged with unlawful possession of firearms. He's currently aiming to be arraigned on July 22, 2024. This is all the information available on the case at the moment. All we can do now is sit back and watch as the case unfolds. Thanks for making it to the end of this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next post. See you next time.